Welcome to another episode, the 60th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hasera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we debrief some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Because we want to hear their stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private aviation operations? Listening to these stories and hearing these lessons learned give us a greater appreciation for how does the aviation world work, but more importantly, increases critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Many of these stories you're going to hear for the very first time on the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I think one of the most important things about my show is I give veterans an opportunity to tell their stories, and in a way, it's kind of healing for them. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show is brought to you by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot aircraft profiles printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to the walls of your home, office, or hangar. So I want all of you to go by wallpilot.com, and we've got, I think, 129 ready to print World War II airplanes all the way up to 5th gen fighters. But we can also do custom orders for you. If there's a particular airplane you really love to have on your wall with your name on it from a particular squadron with a particular tail number and a custom weapons load, then go and fill out the order form on wallpilot.com and we can put that together. Many of the ready to print profiles are because we interviewed the people that were flying the airplane. Go by and take a look at these really incredibly detailed and well-researched profile drawings at wallpilot.com. How many of you know that in the last 3 years, the United States has evacuated 4 embassies: Afghanistan, Ukraine, Belarus, and last week the Sudan. So today, I want to explain to you what a non-combatant evacuation operation is and why they're so dangerous, and some of the lessons that we've learned from having to go into an embassy and get everybody out. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show and talk about non-combatant evacuation operations, or NEOs. I didn't even know what a NEO was until I was introduced to them in January of 1991. Right before the opening of Operation Desert Storm on the 17th of January 1991, we had some air refueling missions on a track that went up and down the Red Sea, and these airplanes were heading farther south. And we're like, what are these guys doing? And then we hear about an operation called Eastern Exit. And of course, we're all scratching our heads going, what's that? And what it was the non-combatant evacuation of American citizens and other diplomats from the embassy in Mogadishu, Somalia. And we're like, okay, this is interesting. And this happened like the first week of January, the 3rd through about the 7th of January, when 2 of the Navy ships that were carrying Marines that were going to be part of Operation Desert Storm were called away to go down to Mogadishu and perform this non-combatant evacuation operation, or NEO. The original plan was to fly C-130s into Mogadishu International Airport, and there was an AC-130 that was coming out of Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, that was going to offer fire support. Obviously, this C-130s and AC-130s were probably going to be part of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm in a matter of days. Well, the opposing forces of General Aidid in Somalia took over Mogadishu International Airport, so that plan went out the window. The USS Guam and the USS Trenton, which had deployed into the Northern Arabian Gulf for Operation Desert Storm, were chosen to leave the Northern Arabian Gulf and steam to a place off of the coast of Mogadishu. Mogadishu, if you guys don't know your geography, is right on the coast of Somalia in the Indian Ocean. Well, these 2 ships went down there with their Marine contingent units on board, and the Marine units, they're called Marine Expeditionary Units, they go through a special qualification where they are qualified and a box is checked on their report cards that they are capable of doing this type of operation. And a lot of the Marine Expeditionary Units will also be called Special Operations Capable. So it's MEU SOC, meaning this Marine Expeditionary Unit of about, I think, 1,500 Marines is capable of doing these non-combatant evacuation operations. They also have what's called trap teams, and they're also Special Operations Capable, or SOC capable. That's what the USS Guam and USS Trenton Marines did. They go down there, and at 2:45 in the middle of the morning, I believe it was on the 5th of January, and again, we're 12 days away from the beginning of Desert Storm. Two of these big CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters carrying, I think it was 51 Marines and 9 SEALs, take off for the embassy in Mogadishu, go in there and land. And fortunately for these guys, a former Marine security guard that had been at the Mogadishu embassy was part of the MEU that was going to do this. And of course, he had firsthand knowledge of what the place looked like. The new embassy had undergone a lot of changes, but still, this particular Marine security guard was very valuable in being able to say, okay, look, here's things you got to watch out for. Here's things you got to do. But they were able to get everybody out in Operation Eastern Exit. I think it was about 200 U.S. People and a bunch of other diplomats from other countries, fly them out to these landing ship dock, and the USS Guam is what's called a large deck amphibious assault ship. I mean, it's big. It's like an aircraft carrier. Not quite as big as the Nimitz class, but it's good size. And the really cool thing about these Iwo Jima class amphibious assault ships is the back of the boat kind of goes into the water. They flood the back of these Iwo Jima amphibious assault ships so that the Marines can go out in their amphibious vehicles, and they will back the boat up to the shore, a mile offshore, and all of these amphibious tracks, vehicles, and everything will go right off the back into the water and have their little propellers out, drive them onto shore, and then when they get on shore, they kind of become armored personnel carriers. It's really an amazing thing to see. I have been on the USS Iwo Jima and have seen this big well deck when I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College, and that's where I learned from one of our Marines that I was teaching with what goes on in these NEOs, these non-combatant evacuation operations. So that's when I first learned about these things. Well, as I mentioned to you, we've done 4 NEOs in the last 3 years. All of you know about the non-combatant evacuation operation in Afghanistan. You've seen all of the video of the Afghanis mobbing a C-17 trying to get on the airplane and get out. We had the embassy in the Ukraine that had a non-combatant evacuation operation, a NEO, to get everybody out of there when the Russians invaded last year. We've had another one in Belarus when things went south there and we had to get all of our embassy people out of Belarus. And last week, we had our 4th NEO out of our U.S. Embassy in Khartoum, the Sudan. And that was a really interesting one because it was done from our base in the Horn of Africa. So what I want to do real quick is there's actually a joint publication, Joint Pub 3-68, that shows all of the things that you need to know and plan for when you're doing a NEO. And I'm going to kind of go through one of the checklists that it has and just kind of highlight some of the really important things that you have to think about when you're going into a NEO. The first thing you have to figure out is, what's the threat? Are we going into a passive environment, meaning there isn't anybody shooting at you? Are you going into an uncertain environment, meaning people may shoot at you? Or are you going into a hostile environment where there are people shooting at you? And those may become confused after you start your NEO, because you may go from a passive environment where nobody is shooting at you. All of a sudden you show up and everybody's like going, oh, they're here. And now it can go to a hostile environment very, very fast. An example of a hostile environment is when Ambassador Chris Stevens in Libya was killed, along with several of his security detail that were former Navy SEALs. That September 11th attack, no doubt planned by Al-Qaeda, they took over the embassy and killed a lot of people doing it. And that whole event was incredible courage, bravery, and stamina to keeps a lot of people alive, but a lot of people got killed too. Why we didn't do a NEO for that, and I know of one person who spoke that was on a response team that said everything was waiting to go do that. Why that was called off, I don't know. But those are the three kinds of environments: passive, nobody's shooting; uncertain, you don't know who's shooting; and hostile. There are people actively trying to get into your embassy and hurt your people. Here's a list of planning factors when you're looking at the planning and execution of a non-combatant evacuation operation. I'm going to just say NEO from now on. The first thing is you got to look at possible courses of action for different threat environments. If it's a benign environment, a permissive environment is going to be way different than, obviously, a hostile environment. You're going to have to take more soldiers, which means you also have to have a very, very clear set of rules of engagement. And those rules of engagement may not be made by a military guy. It may be made by the ambassador, who's the chief of the mission, and they may be very restrictive. And that's one of the problems you have to deal with. You will have the Department of Defense and the Department of State maybe at odds with each other when you do one of these things because of the threat environment that they're going into. Next, the location of the evacuation sites. It may not just be the embassy. A matter of fact, everybody may be out of the embassy and you may be on a soccer field or something open field outside of town. Who knows? There may be more than one evacuation site, and you have to look at how are you going to secure those locations, whether you are in a permissive, uncertain, or hostile environment. The next thing you have to look at is anticipated number of evacuees, total numbers by whichever area you're going to go to, and you categorize them by medical status. First, persons not requiring medical assistance, persons requiring medical assistance prior to evacuation, and persons requiring medical assistance prior to and during evacuation. All of that's got to be figured out. So obviously there is a huge medical planning and execution piece to all of this, particularly in a hostile environment where people have been, particularly in a hostile environment where you may have enemy forces dropping mortars, grenades, rocket-propelled grenades into the embassy compound. Who's hurt? How badly are they hurt? Can they even move? And how are you going to move them? Next is obviously persons requiring emergency medical evacuation. And this may be for a whole host of reasons. Injured people in the battle, whatever it might be. Next thing, location of assembly areas and major supply routes. You may not be able to land a helicopter the size of a Sea Stallion inside the embassy compound. You may have to shuttle people to some open area where something the size of a Sea Stallion or an MH-47 Chinook can land safely with security around that location to fend off anybody that's trying to get in the way. Location of command posts is next. Who are you communicating with? Who's making the decisions either onshore or offshore if one of these ships is involved, like a large deck amphib? Most of the embassies have some type of command post, secure command post in them that they can communicate with military forces. Where is that command post? And maybe that command post has to be shut down because the embassy's been overrun and you have to make a mobile command post. Next thing you got to think about, who are the key personnel? Name, location, desired means of contacting them. Who are the key personnel that you have to get out of there whose lives may endanger? Description of the embassy communication systems, their transportation fleet, warden system, all of that's got to be considered, which is another factor. You have to be able to communicate with the embassy staff somehow, some way. They've all got mobile phones and they've got other types of communication sets, but they may not have up-armored cars or trucks. Those are all things that you have to figure out. Next thing is quantity of class 1 or subsistence supplies that are on hand at the embassy. How long can the folks at the embassy sustain themselves? Do they have food, water? Believe it or not, all of us saw this during COVID. Toilet paper became a problem during COVID. You have to think of all those things. The next thing is class 3 type of things, fuel. Do you have enough fuel to get your vehicles moving to particular areas? And then, of course, class 8 type of medical supplies, you have to look at that also. Will you have to bring medical supplies with you depending on how badly some of these people are injured? Standard map products of the local areas with annotations defining critical landmarks is a must, because guess what happened during Eastern Exit? They had done a lot of modifications to the embassy, and it didn't look the same. And I mentioned they had a Marine security guard on the Guam that had been there in Mogadishu, but the building structure had changed and they couldn't find it. They said, oh, it's near this and it looks like this. And in actuality, the building and the embassy location had moved. And it was completely different from when that Marine was there. So you have to have good map products that show you exactly where everything is. Now, of course, with drones on any of the Navy ships, you'll be able to put something overhead that can watch your locations and provide instant intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance so you can see movement, patterns of life around the embassy, all those kinds of things. Those are really important. But the problem is these things happen so fast. It can go from permissive environment, no problem, we got plenty of time, to crisis action planning, people coming over the wall, and a moment's notice. And here's one of the things that I learned about non-combatant evacuation operations while I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College. We had a great Department of State guy there who'd been an ambassador in numerous locations. His father, very famous because he was the first Secretary of the Air Force, Stu Symington. And this ambassador was named after his dad, Stuart Symington. And when we had this seminar where we brought ambassadors into all of the different seminars to talk to them, we learned something really important. The military wants to go in early and get everybody out. The State Department wants to wait until the last minute because it gives them more options. That seemed counterintuitive to me. Wait a minute. Waiting until the last minute means the military guys are rushing like crazy to get you people out. But what the ambassador was saying was, we want to wait till the last minute so that we can negotiate ceasefire, so that we can negotiate safe passage for our embassy folks, all of these different things, whereas the military want to go in there, get it done, get out, and call it good. And that was one of the issues that I didn't realize until we had this discussion with Ambassador Symington saying, all of you military guys, we know you want to come in, get it done, get out. But we as ambassadors get paid a lot of money to make decisions, and we want to wait till the last minute before, send out the calling all dogs, come get us now type of thing. And that really grates on the military because we want to go in, move everybody, get the situation over with, and get out. Now, of course, those decisions depend on what are the enemy courses of action. What are they going to do? Are they going to go from negotiating with us, okay, you guys go ahead and leave, to wait a minute, we can get a lot of money for these people if we keep them, and all of a sudden people are coming over the walls of the embassy trying to capture everybody. And the other thing you have to think about, what are the terrorist threats that we may face if we have to take our people out of the embassy and go from like some soccer field somewhere? These are all things that you have to look at. And all of this planning, all of these items are based on what is the current situation in the country and what are the current threats to operations inside the embassy and threats to our military folks. Because remember, we're going to do this with helicopters. Helicopters are slow. Now, I realize that the Marine Corps now has the Osprey tilt rotor, which goes a lot faster than most helicopters, but still, the highest threats to any rotary wing aircraft comes on takeoff and landing, when they are the most vulnerable, when they are just lifting off, just getting speed under them, or coming into land when they're going slow. Our helicopters obviously have flares. They don't have chaff. Shoulder-fired SAMs are obviously a big problem, but so is small arms fire, and you never know where that's going to come from, or rocket-propelled grenades. You have to have a really, really good understanding of what is the threat. And that comes from parking either a Reaper drone or some other type of Navy drone overhead the location where you're going to do the evacuation, whether it be the embassy or some soccer field or some open field that you've been able to secure, whatever that might be. Threat drives everything. Now that we've covered the planning aspects of a NEO, let's talk about the execution. And there's really 3 ways to do a NEO. The first one is going to probably be in a permissive environment where we bring in tactical airlift like C-130s or C-17s and just start loading everybody on. That doesn't mean you won't have a security force around the perimeter of the airfield to keep people from interfering. And you may even have security forces that are securing the route to the airfield from the embassy, however long that might be. But being able to shuttle everybody to an airport, put them in the back of a C-130 or a C-17 and take off is obviously the ideal way of doing this. And I've been on one of the C-17s that was involved in the evacuation of Afghanistan. And there's a really fascinating story about this. One of the C-17s was able to bring out a lot of Afghani nationals. And they kind of set a record for the number of people they had on the plane. And I believe that record was 825. They had 825 people sitting on the floor and in the seats of the C-17 and were able to get them out. That's a lot of people, particularly when you've got possibly pregnant women or medical emergencies, people that need medical tending to. That's a lot of people to have in one airplane. But if I remember right, that was the number, 825 people sitting on the floor of the airplane. And I believe I've got a picture of it somewhere that I'll have to find, which I'll put in the show notes. The Air Force Museum found out that they had it. So this was like its last trip before it went into the Air Force Museum to showcase this operation to get all of these people out of Afghanistan. That end of runway sign from Kabul International Airport is now on display, I understand, at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, with all of the crews that flew these evacuation missions, signatures on it, and the call sign of their airplanes. I thought that was just a cool story, because when you see this end of runway sign sitting in the airplane in Provo, Utah, you're like, oh, what's this? What's the story behind this? Runway sign got stolen at 1 o'clock in the morning. They were taking off at 1 o'clock in the morning. And the loadmaster says, we need to take that with us. And the pilot says, go get it, hurry. They drop the crew entry door down, run out there, pull it out of the ground, put it on the airplane, and they take off with it. An operation like that, where the airplanes can just fly in, load people on board, and fly out, of course, is the best way to do this. And you're only going to be able to do that probably in a permissive environment, maybe in an uncertain environment, hostile environment, probably not so much, okay? Because obviously a C-17, C-130, any type of airlift airplane, even a C-5, are massive targets you can hit with mortar rounds, RPGs, and so forth, depending on what your security is around your base. A second method I've already mentioned, and that is send in the Marines. The Marines always have a security detail inside the embassies. Any of you who've watched the Jack Ryan series where he's running through embassies, you see Marines there all the time. There's always Marine security detail in our embassies around the world. A Marine expeditionary unit that is on one of these large deck type amphibious assault ships is perfect for doing NEOs. Why is it so perfect? You have all of these Marines that have been tested and certified in doing the non-combatant evacuation operation, and they've also probably got their special operations capable certification along with it. On the deck of these amphibious assault ships, particularly the Iwo Jima and larger assault ships, you have helicopter gunships, you have Hueys, you have the Sea Stallions that the Marines fly, and now you no longer have Aviate Harriers, but you have the F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. The Marines fly the short takeoff and vertical landing or STOVL version of the Joint Strike Fighter. These Marine expeditionary units now have a low observable, faster than the speed of sound capable airplane that can support them when they're doing these types of operations, which is really a huge benefit because the F-35 can carry all kinds of weapons. And of course, it's a massive sensor. The cameras that I've talked to you about all around the airplane that televise stuff in the pilot's helmet is just incredible. They can see behind it, underneath it, around it. I mean, it's just an incredible capability for our Marine expeditionary units to have these kinds of airplanes on the deck. Now, they also have the CV-22 Ospreys, the tilt rotor. These are about 100 to 120 miles an hour faster than most helicopters. They fly like airplanes, but then can also hover like helicopter. It's really an incredible capability for these Marine expeditionary units. You can put a massive amount of Marines in the back of these things, fly them, I think at like 350 knots to some location, and put Marines on that location fairly quickly with low observable, faster than the speed of sound, massive sensor Joint Strike Fighters overhead. Of course, you can use the big Sea Stallion helicopters, and the gunships can also be used for fire support around the embassies. These large deck amphibious assault ships can get very close to shore. They have a command center inside them with all kinds of communication systems. They're capable of launching different types of drones from these amphibious assault ships, and they're really an amazing thing to see. Now, I have not been on the new class assault ships, like the New York class, the San Antonio class, the one that's the catamaran type of one, all right? And believe me, those have incredible capabilities too for sending Marines out the back, all those kinds of things. But a Marine expeditionary unit with these ships is a great way to go in and snatch people out of an embassy. If there's medical problems, as I mentioned, there are all kinds of medical facilities on board these ships. I was in the USS Iwo Jima, and in the middle of the ship, I think it was like on about the third deck, they had 4 operating rooms where they said they can do all the way up to neurosurgery in case a Marine gets hit in the head by shrapnel or a bullet. They can do heart surgery, leg surgery, they've got orthopedics, all of these different things aboard these amphibious type ships, which of course makes them great for humanitarian operations as well as these non-combatant evacuation operations. Oh, and the other thing too, this was another thing that I learned, is they can actually take electrical power lines from inside the ship and bring them ashore so that you have electrical power on shore. I didn't know that until I'd been on one of these. I thought that was amazing. Oh yeah, we can send out like these power lines throughout the back of the ship, and power things up. And of course they have different types of amphibious assault vehicles like the LCAC, the hover vehicle that they can put on shore. They can put tanks inside the LCACs, and they've got their tracks vehicles that they can send out the back also. They have a number of ways of moving the Marines on shore to an embassy, either by helicopter or by these amphibious assault armored vehicles. They can make pure water on board. They can feed all of these 3,000 people that are on board the ship. It's really an amazing thing to see. But the command center of this large deck amphibious assault ship, the Iwo Jima, when we went in there, that was just amazing. And as a matter of fact, it was kind of interesting because I think it was on this trip. Inside the command center, they knew that we were coming aboard. I brought one of my Joint Forces Staff College seminars aboard because the Army guys had never been on one of these things. And we had a Marine sniper with us who, of course, spent a lot of time on them. And he kind of gave us a tour of one of these in Norfolk. And we went up into the command center and he says, well, why don't you bring up like one of the what's the MEU that's deployed right now? Oh, the 26th MEU is now up in the Northern Arabian Gulf. And the sniper says, oh, bring it up on the thing. And all of a sudden, bang, on this board, this operational environment board, he goes right to the Northern Arabian Gulf and goes right to the amphibious assault ship that they're on and shows us its exact location. So it's got all kinds of communications via satellite, and of course, the ability to operate drones from aboard the ship. And I can't stress the importance of having these drones because you're able to send these things ashore and really get a good look at the patterns of life around the extraction locations. You can see in a micro and macro view what's going on around the extraction location, whether that be the embassy, some open field, some soccer stadium, it doesn't matter. Drones have really, really improved our ability to find out what's going on and to eliminate uncertainty. And as I mentioned previously, the elements of the decision maker's dilemma: risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. If I have timely quality information, I'm able to act with more certainty with a reduction of second and third order effects. And drones help you do that. And of course, you can launch drones from any of these particular types of ships. I want to spend just a few moments on a concept that is very key to the Marines, and it's called the Marine Air Ground Task Force, or MAGTF. The Marines are very good at shaping their task force with the things that they need under this Marine Air Ground Task Force concept. If you're going ashore to evacuate an embassy, you can plan the resources for the air side and for the ground side and know exactly what you need to take, exactly what you need to plan for, how much gas it's going to take to get them there, what they're going to need when they get on the ground. And the Marines are really good at shaping their resources based on the mission and the threat. And they do it under this Marine Air Ground Task Force concept, the MAGTF concept. And aboard all of these different ships, they will have all of the resources that they require in order to be able to pull off a NEO. And like I said, in the Marine Air Ground Task Force concept, they will be able to pull all the resources from around the ship and say, okay, here's what I need, and begin planning and executing based on shaping what exactly they need to go in and pull people out, with all the medical people, the people in the air, people on the ground, security force, and of course, you can introduce special operations forces because some of the Marine expeditionary units are special operations capable, or you have like a SEAL team with you, maybe a Delta Force team with you. More than likely a SEAL team that is going to go along with this Marine Air Ground Task Force to help them perform this non-combatant evacuation. The third method for pulling a NEO off, of course, is sending in special forces, such as the SEALs, Delta Force, MH-47s from the 160th Special Operation Aviation Regiment, and all of the planning and execution that goes along with this Special Operations Force going in and doing the deed. Now, from what I understand, reading everything that I've read so far, is that the non-combatant evacuation NEO from the embassy in Khartoum in a somewhat hostile environment where both factions are shooting at each other was done by SEAL Team 6 and members of the 2nd Special Forces Group out of Fort Bragg. They did this out of Camp Lemonnier that is in Djibouti, which means they had to fly 800 miles in the helos in order to get this done, which required, of course, a refueling in, I think it was Ethiopia, that they landed and did this air refueling. Now, one of the ways you can do this air refueling of these helicopters, one way to refuel this task force is in the air behind either MC-130s of Air Force Special Operations Command or the Marine Corps Battle Hercs, because they've all got drogue baskets on them. They do the helicopter refuelings. It's not unusual for them to do this kind of stuff. We can't do it on our tanker, the helicopters, because we can't slow down enough, but we can fill up the MC-130s to the gills, and of course, they take the fuel down and refuel the helicopters. There's another method for refueling helos, and it's called FARP, Forward Air Refueling Point. And I've actually experienced this in my career. When I was at Kadena, I flew with our MH-60 Pavehawk, the 33rd Rescue Squadron, one particular night. I was getting ready to do this big exercise, and I wanted to get a better understanding of how to do a search and rescue exercise. And my good friend Poison said, "Hey, come fly with me." He gave me all the night vision goggle training, and we went out and flew. I think it was for like 3 hours. But the first event we did was a forward air refueling point operation behind a Marine Corps C-130. And what they did was the Marine Corps C-130 had taken off out of the Marine Corps Air Base not too far from Kadena, landed at Kadena, taxied around onto what we called the Bravo patio, which was this big, massive taxiway across the runways. And the aircrew on the Marine Battle Herc took fuel hoses out the back. And when the two of us landed, there was me and one helicopter, and we were flying formation that night with another one that was on a check ride of all things. The hoses came out of the back of the Marine Corps Herc. They plugged them into the helicopters and refilled them back up to full again. And we were on the ground for probably about 8 to 10 minutes, the blades spinning with these hoses hooked up to our helicopter behind this Marine Corps C-130. And this is a common thing that we perform. This forward air refueling point, or FARP point, which they probably used to refuel these helicopters if they didn't do it in the air. Now, the MH-47 Chinooks of the 160th SOAR are very capable of refueling in the air, also capable of doing the same thing on the ground behind an MC or Marine C-130J Battle Herc. They left that refueling point, went to Khartoum, and of course set up their perimeter and their security around the embassy, and were able to get, I think it was like 100 people out, to include some other diplomats and people there in the embassy, and fly them out. And of course, it says they were only on the ground for an hour in Khartoum. I saw the embassy, and there's this very large open space inside the embassy wall. I don't know how big it was, but you could land, I know, at least one Chinook inside that embassy compound, maybe two. I'd have to take a better look at it on Google Earth. They were on the ground for an hour, got everybody in the back of the 160th SOAR Chinooks, and then went back for a refueling, and then on back to Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. And I think from there, the embassy evacuees went to Frankfurt, Germany, Landstuhl in the hospital there to get checked out. And some of them, of course, may have come home too. I'm not sure. But that's a third way of doing one of these non-combatant evacuation operations. You just send these very elite special forces group in there with another special forces group from Fort Bragg on a number of these helicopters. And of course, you have to remember, Air Force Special Operations Command does have MV-22 Ospreys that are air refuelable in the air behind the MC-130s. And for Africa, they would have come out of England, RAF Mildenhall, to do that mission. But it doesn't seem that that's what they used. We have been at Camp Lemonnier for a very long time. They also operate the MQ-9 Reapers out of here. These are the armed Reaper drones that can be flown from either Djibouti or from Indian Springs in Nevada, north of Las Vegas. If you go to Google Earth, you can actually get a really good overall picture of what is at Camp Lemonnier. And of course, there's a big airfield there also. They've had fighter planes in there to include F-15Es that were running around down in the Horn of Africa dealing with the Al-Shabaab and other Al-Qaeda groups that were down there too. But they have a lot of what's called launch recovery elements, or LREs, which are these mobile homes that have the operating stations for the Reapers inside them. And there's a number of them down there. And like I said, Google Earth is a great intelligence tool, because you can go there and zoom in and you can see all of these different things on the ramp at the airfield. And of course, at Camp Lemonnier, all of the things that are there. And believe it or not, the Chinese are trying to build some type of big base there also, very close to ours. I'll just leave that where it's at. The Special Forces folks came out of Djibouti, did the 800 miles there, 800 miles back, 1,600 mile round trip, and pulled off this evacuation out of the embassy. And they were only on the ground for an hour, according to all the reports that I've seen. The DOD has released video of the helicopters with the Special Forces group loading up, the SEALs loading up and taking off and going in there and coming back out, that I'm going to try and find and see if I can put in the show notes below. So those are the three methods of doing a NEO. Sending airplanes into an international airport, having people load up on the airplanes and flying them out, a lot like we saw in Afghanistan. Second method, send in the Marines, a Marine Expeditionary Unit off of some amphibious assault ship, a lot of helicopters going in or Ospreys going in, landing with the Marines, securing the embassy or the evacuation location, getting everybody on the back of the helicopters and then pulling everybody out. Or, as they did in Khartoum last week, send in very elite special forces and the 2nd Special Forces group from Fort Bragg and have them do it. And obviously, the special forces at Fort Bragg and SEAL Team 6 are more than capable and trained to do this and exercise to do this kind of a mission. I want to emphasize to you that this is one of the most intense missions that the military does, a NEO. I've mentioned to you already the decision-making process. The military does not own the hammer on the decision to go in and evacuate. The State Department does. And they wait until the last minute to say, okay, come get us, which in certain situations where you're in a hostile environment can really be dicey and can put people at risk. But every one of these ambassadors that I've ever talked to have said, we will wait till the last minute because it gives us options. And those options are usually negotiations with either the factions or the people doing the coup or whatever reason that they have to get out. They wait till the last minute because it creates more options as they go along until they figure out there's nothing that's going to work and we got to get out of here. And the military thinks we got to go in there, get you out, and we want to do it early. It never happens that way. Second lesson learned. This used to be true, but by looking at what I told you here not too long ago, it's spread to more places. But we always said, when you say NEO, you say Africa. Most of the NEOs that our military have performed have been on the African continent, either in the Congo, Liberia, several times, Somalia, now the Sudan. It seems we were always doing some kind of NEO on the continent of Africa? Well, recently, of course, we can add Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Belarus to that. But for the most part, a lot of these take place in Africa and some of these unstable nations. There are a lot of planning factors that you have to look at and understand when you're doing a NEO. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance vehicles help immensely, but you may not get the really high value ones, such as the rivet joint that is listening to all the signals, but you may get the Army's version of signals intelligence. It really depends on what special forces assets you have that are participating. The SEAL teams have a lot of assets available to them, both listening, observing, and of course, the Mark I eyeball, just going out there and seeing for yourself. The Air Force and the Navy have a number of different types of drones that they can put overhead to gather intelligence and to do some signals intelligence. During these NEOs, when the factions are fighting or the adversarial groups are trying to get over the wall, they're always talking on their cell phones, which is something that we can exploit. And it's an incredible capability that we have to do that, because not only can we hear, but we can pinpoint where they're at. And so that gives us the ability to maybe go hamper their operations in some way by direct action or even indirect action. We do a lot of things in the electromagnetic spectrum where we can send out false reports, and in the electronic world, you can mess with phones, you can mess with radios, you can even mess with TVs and monitors, as we all know. And we are extremely good at messing with other people's communications. The military brings a lot of tools that we can use for doing these NEOs and precisely pinpointing where the bad guys are in relation to where the good guys are. And that can come from a lot of different available means and methods that our military has. And of course, we have on the civilian side too in the CIA. And yes, the CIA has been involved with their special ops guys in some of these non-combatant evacuation operations too. Talking with this Marine Corps sniper that I had as a student who had done one or two of these NEOs, he told me that the one thing that always bothered them was knowing when it went from a passive environment to a hostile environment and how fast that could happen. You really have to understand what are the intentions of those that are threatening you and being able to tap into either their phone network, their communication network, whatever it is, and put eyes on to what they're doing. In the case of Libya and Ambassador Stevens, there was a Predator drone overhead that saw all of these Al-Qaeda folks coming down the street, getting ready to do what they were going to do. So we knew their intentions. Being able to discern their intentions is one of these big lessons learned, because it can switch from a passive environment to a hostile environment in a matter of minutes. And that's when things begin to get really intense for whatever forces we have on the ground. Now, if we have something like an AC-130 gunship overhead, that's going to make life easy. If we have Marine snipers that are up high somewhere and overlooking, that's going to make things pretty easy too, because not only can they do direct action, but snipers are incredible intelligence and reconnaissance and surveillance assets too, because they notice differences in things around them. They know ranges, they understand the environment, they look out and they can see things happening, and understand what those things that are happening might mean. But again, this Marine sniper says, the problem, Sluggo, is going from knowing when we're in a passive environment to where now we may have to be shooting people. And again, that rules of engagement list is probably going to be made by the ambassador, not a military guy, a State Department guy. And You can make recommendations, suggestions, rant and rave all you want. But if that ambassador has his mind made up that these are the rules of engagement, then you got to go with those. And some people may say it's easier to obtain forgiveness than permission. And I guess that all depends on the situation. But in most of these NEOs, the rules of engagement, and it says in this doctrine pub that the State Department and the ambassador is going to say, these are going to be the rules of engagement, because he doesn't want to leave the situation in such a bad way that we can't come back. And if we start killing people en masse, then obviously we are not going to be able to come back. And the State Department always, always, always wants to come back. Liberia is a classic example where we have evacuated an embassy and then gone back in there years later, evacuated the embassy, gone back in there years later. That's the way the State Department looks at things. And so one of these lessons learned is you may have very restrictive ROE where you cannot shoot a column of people that are carrying AKs coming down the street unless they're actively pointing at you, threatening you, and firing upon you. The military guys, that kind of grates on us. We tend to be very proactive in the things that we do. And let's get in there, get everybody out, get this over with, where the State Department waits until the last minute. Oh, one other thing that this Marine sniper mentioned to me too was clear command and control lines and clear communications with the military, both onshore and offshore or overhead. He says you've got to establish very early who has the hammer on the situation and make sure that the State Department, the Department of Defense, and non-government agencies or intergovernment agencies like the CIA, everybody understands who's in control, who's got control over what, and what areas or locations they have control over. And when you have a deteriorating environment, that can be very problematic. The next thing he mentioned is being able to establish and maintain communications with the civilians, Department of State folks, embassy folks inside the compound or whatever location they are at. They have iridium phones, satellite phones, all those different kinds of things in these embassies, radios, I'm sure backpack radios, all those kinds of things. But if you lose communications with the people that you are trying to evacuate, things become really, really hard because they may be intermingled with the bad guys. They may be going down a particular street that has bad guys on both sides. And now you've really, really got to be careful when you're going to release ordnance or you're going to start shooting people. You must stay in constant communication until the last person is aboard an MV-22, CV-22, Sea Stallion helicopter, C-130, so that you can make sure everybody is out, everybody is safe, you didn't leave anybody behind. That comm gear can suffer during these intense situations. And of course, losing communications with the people that you're trying to evacuate throws a lot of uncertainty in the situation because now you don't know where they are, what their situation is, and what medical help they need. So establishing those clear, concise command and control lines, clear and concise rules of engagement, and maintaining a constant communications with the people you're evacuating is critical during these operations. I told all of you when I did the episode on the Chinese spy balloon that I was reluctant to do current events. I'm reluctant to do current events because first of all, I'm a political science major and I don't want to get political on any of this stuff. And I have been very, very careful not to show my political leanings one way or the other. The other reason is I just didn't know if you, my listeners, wanted to hear about military operations in these things that are currently going on around the world. I chose to do this episode because these NEOs are one of the most dangerous and intense things that the military does. Because the military is not in control. The State Department really runs the show here. And the threats that we face. And it's really an amazing story that we had a task force, a special operations task force, that was able to fly 800 miles with refueling of the helicopters, spend an hour on the ground in Khartoum at our embassy, load everybody up with these 51 Marines and 9 SEAL Team 6 guys, shuffling everybody on board, and then take off and fly 800 miles back with another refueling. And I think there was even a third one, if I remember right, reading one article. And I can't remember where or why, as they went from Djibouti to Khartoum and then back again. There's all kinds of lessons learned when you're doing something this dangerous and this intense. And I'm going to try and find one of my Marine buddies that has not only planned but executed one of these NEOs to come on. And I can think of several, by the way, because it really is a very interesting mission where the military isn't going in to kill people and break things. We are going in kind of a humanitarian way to evacuate people out of a particular location and bring them back home alive. And those that are sick or wounded, give them the medical treatment that they need for them to be able to survive one of these evacuation operations. I've talked about the 3 methods for doing this. Flying into the airport doing it, kind of like we did in Kabul, sending in the Marines and MEU task force, or have the special operations folks go in and do it. We're fortunate that in our military, we have the reach to be able to do these kinds of missions and help save our citizens from some of these really terrible situations where, seriously, a country is going to hell. And it's going to hell quickly. And thank heavens we have courageous, brave, and highly skilled men and women in the United States military that can pull this non-combatant evacuation mission off. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, the 60th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast on non-combatant evacuation or NEO operations, seeing as how we've done 4 in 3 years. I wanted you, my listeners, to get a better understanding of how the military operates in one of these type of situations and some of the lessons learned both from our doctrine pubs and some from the people that I've met that have done this. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast is financially supported by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot profiles of aircraft printed on vinyl you can peel off and stick to any flat surface. Or a lot of people just frame them the way that they are. There are 129 ready-to-print profiles on the website at wallpilot.com, or we can do a custom one for you. We just did a custom F-15 for a guy. It's got his name, the unit he flew with, and his tail number on an 8-foot print of an F-15. Oh, and with the weapons load that he wanted too. And we can put any weapons load on any airplane. We have airplanes from World War II all the way up to 5th gen fighters. I'm working on 2 helicopters, Apache and Sea King. We are also working on World War I airplanes now, just the most famous ones. I'm not going to delve into some of the less obscure ones. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast can be found on my website at markasera.com under the podcast pull-down box. Please take some time to go by, download some of these episodes and listen to them while you're commuting back and forth to work or on a long drive. I really appreciate all of you downloading them. We are approaching 15,000 downloads out of 60 episodes. I've been doing this about a year and a half now, which is pretty good. Also, go by the Lieutenant Colonel Marcusera TikTok page, and I will soon have my YouTube page up because I've been asked by several people, how come you don't do video with the audio? Right now, it's because it takes so long to do it. It takes a long time to edit all this, and I've been shying away from doing video, but that may change here soon. Folks, Thanks again for tuning in and downloading and listening to this episode on Non-Combatant Evacuation Operations. Look forward to talking to you next week. I'm lining up a couple of really incredible guests to include an Iranian F-4 pilot that flew during the Iran-Iraq war and planned the longest F-4 mission at 300 feet. Yes, they were refueling at 300 feet behind a 747. Thanks again, folks. Talk to you next week.